Welcome to Crime Noir. Today, we're going to take a little detour from our usual fare. In writing about crime, the roles are usually distinct. There are good guys and there are bad guys. There are cops and robbers. In the noir genre, the lines between good and evil are often blurred. The good guy is not always as virtuous as we would like him to be. Sometimes the bad guy turns out not to be as evil as we thought he was. We all hope that real life differs from fiction, but sometimes it doesn't, and that is the case here. My original plan was to write about how the FBI used its considerable powers and resources to destroy the life of a young woman whose only sin was to support causes she believed in. As I worked my way through the considerable mass of information available, I found that those abuses were much longer lived and pervasive than I ever imagined. This is not a story about one evil person or even a criminal gang. This is a story about a government agency gone rogue. It's a story about what happens when people in power come to believe that the ends justify the means, and the human wreckage they leave in their wake is simply a sacrifice to the greater good. Although congressional hearings chaired by Senator Frank Church in the 1970s convinced most Americans that these unconstitutional, illegal actions were an aberration that ended with the revelations of those hearings, they almost certainly continue in some form to this day. When I first began researching this story, I thought I would focus on how it affected one person in particular, actress Jean Seberg. As I dug into the research, I found that limiting the scope to one person would be too difficult. The breadth of what happened was too large, too pervasive, and too sinister to focus on only one victim. The more I discovered, the more I realized that, like in most stories, it is best to start at the beginning, and this story's beginning goes further back than I imagined. It dates back to the time before the FBI was known as the FBI, and it cuts across multiple presidential administrations of both political parties. It began before the First World War. This is Crime Noir, Episode 7, COINTELPRO. If you find this video interesting, make sure to like and subscribe. If you know of a crime that you think we should cover, mention it in the comments. With that out of the way, let's grab our black bags and break into this dark chapter of the American story. At the dawn of the 20th century, the U.S. was in a wave of European immigration, mostly consisting of people from Southern and Eastern Europe. As with every mass immigration, those who had arrived before looked upon the newcomers with a mixture of disdain, bigotry, and fear. The new arrivals included large numbers of Italians with their Catholicism and Jews with their insular communities and strange rituals. Their growing presence in the ultimate neighborhoods upset the apple carts of the established Northern European and mostly Protestant people who had come before them. The frontier was closed, so unlike previous groups of immigrants, these newcomers had little hope of moving west to claim homesteads on the prairies. At the same time, the arrival of steam-powered ships enabled ever larger groups of people to make the journey across the ocean. What had been a comparative trickle became a flood that pooled in nearly cloistered neighborhoods of the larger cities, and, like most that preceded them, these immigrants took jobs at the bottom of the economic ladder. They staffed the slaughterhouses, became stevedores on the docks, and landed in the dull, repetitive work of thousands of sweatshops throughout the major cities. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing throughout the 19th century, and the process for a workman to learn a trade and rise through the economic strata had radically changed. Skilled artisans working in small shops were replaced by semi-skilled laborers working in factories. The power of individuals to make their way based on their skills and work ethic alone had become greatly diminished, which placed the workers at the mercy of their employers. Until the mid-1800s, a group of workers banding together to bargain for better wages and conditions was considered a criminal conspiracy. Although labor unions were not banned, many of the actions they might take, such as calling a strike, could bring the law down upon them. This all began to change as the 1800s progressed, and the new immigrants, who were among the most exploited workers, were ripe for recruitment into the burgeoning labor movement. At the same time, some other ideas had made the journey across the sea. The Communist Manifesto had been published in 1848 and was followed by the 3 volumes of Das Kapital published between 1867 and 1894. Some of the ideas they contained were appealing to people working arduous dead-end jobs in packing houses and sweatshops. Trade and labor unions began to grow and flex their muscles, which more often than not led to labor violence. Scattered among the tides of immigrants was a smattering of socialists, communists, and anarchists. They represented a tiny portion of union membership and an even smaller fraction of the immigrant population, but they were very vocal, occasionally carried out acts of violence, and claimed responsibility for those actions while threatening more. That terrified people. There had been anarchists and communists in the United States going back at least to the 1880s, and there had been attempts to suppress them. These attempts accelerated as they became involved in the labor movement, but there were no federal statutes and no federal law enforcement organizations empowered to deal with them. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley was shot by Leon Czolgosz, a self-professed anarchist who believed that McKinley was the head of a suppressive government and it was his duty to shoot him. Upon McKinley's death, Theodore Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt was a reformer, and he believed that the federal government had an obligation to guide industry to foster justice in an industrial nation. Among the many things Teddy Roosevelt brought to the U.S. government was a new national law enforcement agency. On July 26, 1908, under direction of President Roosevelt, Attorney General Charles Bonaparte issued an order that created the Bureau of Investigation, with 34 special agents assigned. Its first, rather inauspicious task was conducting surveys of houses of prostitution in preparation for enforcing the Mann Act. They soon expanded their reach to investigate various labor unions, anarchists, and communists, but with few federal laws to enforce, their activities were limited to investigation. That is, until World War I began. The war had raged for 33 months when the United States became an active belligerent. During that time, the fledgling Bureau of Investigation found itself hamstrung by the fact that the existing Espionage Act of 1911 stipulated a maximum fine of only $1,000 or up to a year in prison for spying in the United States. However, there's nothing like a crisis to stir Congress into action, so they passed the Espionage Act of 1917, which stipulated somewhat more severe penalties for spying. It became a capital offense eligible for the death penalty. With that law in hand, the Bureau of Investigation, along with more than a few judges and prosecutors, decided that even speaking out against the war constituted a crime under the Espionage Act. Here's a hint. It wasn't, because, the First Amendment. But that didn't stop the Bureau from subjecting anyone whose neighbor reported them to an intensive investigation. It never reached East German Stasi proportions, but denunciation driven by fear was definitely part of the program. The fear became hysteria after the end of the First World War. The old order in Europe was in tatters, and there were uprisings and rebellions around the world as people who had lived under colonial regimes saw the disarray as their opportunity to break free. The war was over. The fighting had stopped, but not completely. The old order had been largely swept away, and people living under the yoke of colonial rule around the world thought Woodrow Wilson's 14 points were their path to independence. They soon discovered, though, that the self-determination Wilson described in his 14 points only applied to Europeans. Meanwhile, the people of Eastern Europe took advantage of the chaos in the last months of the war to break away from the crumbling Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires to form their own nations. The Bolsheviks had seized control of Russia, executed Tsar Nicholas Romanov along with his entire family, and were now preaching world revolution. While the Big Four, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Lloyd George of the United Kingdom, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy were at Versailles deciding the fate of Europe, radicals in the U.S. were engaging in a bombing campaign against government offices and what they considered symbols of the capitalist hegemony. This also terrified people. There was a strong and pervasive belief that the world was coming apart at the seams. On April 28, 1919, a small box arrived in the mail at the office of Seattle Mayor Ole Hansen. The box was 6 inches by 3 inches by 1 inch. It was wrapped in bright green paper and was marked Gimbel Brothers Novelty Samples on its top. One side was marked open. The mayor was out of town, having traveled to Denver, Colorado to take part in a Victory Loan event, so the city auditor, M.H. Strauss, opened the package. He failed to notice the marking on the box's edge telling him which end to open, and instead opened the other end. A glass vial tumbled out of the box and broke on the floor. It contained a clear liquid that promptly dissolved the varnish coating the wooden floorboards. Strauss didn't know what the box was supposed to be, so he called the police, who took it to the station for examination. The box contained a wooden block that had been carved out to hold 1/3 of a stick of dynamite, 2 blasting caps, and a vial of acid rigged with a striker that would break the vial when the marked end of the box was opened. The acid would then be poured onto the blasting caps, igniting them and setting off the dynamite. Contrary to what was written in the newspapers of the time, the bomb was not strong enough to blow out the side of a building, but it would certainly maim or even kill the person who opened the box. Mr. Strauss was saved by his failure to pay attention to detail. 2 days later, what seemed to be an isolated incident in Seattle took on national significance when a clerk at a New York City post office set aside 17 packages that had insufficient postage. That same day, a package identical to that sent to Mayor Hansen arrived at the Atlanta home of former Senator Thomas Hardwick. The package exploded when his maid opened it, severely injuring her and the senator's wife, who was standing nearby. By May 1st, over 30 packages had been intercepted, and the common bond among the intended victims was theorized. Nearly all of them had been involved in anti-immigrant legislation, investigations of anarchist groups, or the prosecution and deportation of members of the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the IWW or the Wobblies. The mail bombs were only the beginning of a series of bombings, robberies, and random violence that continued into the 1920s, but this is important. Even now, what happened in 1919 and 1920 is called a Red Scare. But the people who were mailing the bombs and creating the chaos were not communists, they were anarchists. The national response was swift. Enter Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and a then unknown bureaucrat named J. Edgar Hoover. In 1920, John Edgar Hoover was a newly hired lawyer in the Department of Justice. He had graduated from the George Washington University, which at the time was primarily a training ground for D.C. residents seeking jobs within the federal government. While at George Washington, he was also a member of the Kappa Nu chapter of the Kappa Alpha Order, a fraternity dedicated to the desire to carry on the legacy of the incomparable flower of Southern knighthood. That's a quote from their charter. Upon obtaining his law degree in 1917, Hoover was hired by the Justice Department's War Emergency Bureau. While the pay was not all that great, about $24,000 in today's money, it was exempt from the draft. Hoover was soon promoted to head the division's Enemy Alien Bureau with the mandate to arrest and jail disloyal foreigners without trial. He quickly compiled a list of 1,400 suspicious aliens, arrested 98 of them, and declared the remainder arrestable. This was Mr. Hoover's first experience in conducting mass surveillance. With the war's end, 24-year-old J. Edgar Hoover moved to the Bureau of Investigation, where he was placed in charge of what was then known as the Radical Division. In this capacity, Hoover oversaw surveillance operations targeting individuals assessed by the Bureau to be leftist, communist, anarchists, or even moderately progressive. Targets included feminist and founding member of the American Communist Party, Rosa Pastor Stokes, anarchists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, and future Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Felix Frankfurter. To be clear, J. Edgar Hoover's first assignment in what would become the FBI was to supervise a mass surveillance operation not against people who had committed crimes, but against people the Bureau felt were a danger to the status quo. He got this assignment before the anarchist bombings of late 1919 and 1920. However, there was a problem with Hoover's plans. The Bureau of Investigation had no power to deport anyone. That power rested with the Department of Labor, and the acting Secretary of Labor, Louis Post, was not cooperating. Post investigated the thousands of records submitted to him by Hoover over the course of 1919 and early 1920 and reduced the number of people to be expelled from several thousand to 556. The courts backed him up. Although Post was threatened with impeachment, he successfully defended himself before the House Rules Committee. Attorney General Palmer was also called before the committee and doubled down on the raids, arrests, and deportation program. In the end, Post was lauded in the press for defending the rule of law, while Palmer largely got pilloried for the raids, mass arrests, and random deportations. Palmer intended to run for president in 1920, and the public censure derailed that plan. The whole affair didn't seem to hurt J. Edgar Hoover very much, however. In 1921, at the age of 26, J. Edgar Hoover was appointed as the 5th director of the Bureau of Investigation. At the time, there were a total of 650 employees, including 450 special agents scattered about the country. 4 of the agents were women, all stationed in Washington. Hoover forced them out, and there would be no more female agents under his tenure. There were also implicit hiring practices that greatly limited opportunities for minorities as special agents. Hoover created an organization that was overwhelmingly white, male, and Protestant. The Bureau spent the 1920s assisting in liquor investigations, monitoring the activities of the Ku Klux Klan, and conducting several homicide investigations, the most famous being the Osage Indian murders, recently dramatized in the Martin Scorsese film Killers of the Flower Moon. Many of these investigations utilized the new technology of telephone taps, and they did these wiretaps without warrants. When one of their cases was challenged in court, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that wiretaps did not violate the Fourth Amendment as long as the agency did not break into a person's property to place them. At that time, most wiretaps were conducted at the telephone exchanges, and in those days, Ma Bell was not particularly concerned about protecting its customers' privacy from intrusive government agencies. This officially came to an abrupt end in 1924 when Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone, a constitutional scholar and later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, ordered a prohibition on all use of wiretapping within the Justice Department, including the Bureau of Investigation. His successor, John Sargent, formalized the ban by including the following in the Bureau's Manual of Rules and Regulations. Unethical tactics. Wiretapping, entrapment, or the use of any other improper, illegal, or unethical tactics in procuring information in connection with investigative activity will not be tolerated by the Bureau. Now, here's something to think about. Attorney General Sargent wanted to formalize the ban on wiretapping. Fine. What activities prompted him to put in writing that federal law enforcement officers were not to entrap people or use illegal tactics to gather information? What were they doing, and to whom were they doing it? In contrast, during this time, the Bureau of Prohibition was allowed to use wiretaps to gather information for its investigations. But in 1931, the Bureau of Prohibition was transferred from the Department of the Treasury to the Department of Justice, which created a problem for then Attorney General William Mitchell. He couldn't have two bureaus within the department with different evidentiary rules, so he granted the directors of the two bureaus the power to authorize wiretaps on their own. No warrant or judicial involvement desired or required. In 1935, the Bureau of Investigation was reorganized and renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation, commonly referred to as the FBI. In this reorganization, the Bureau received expanded powers, including a requirement that all federal, state, and local agencies forward any fingerprints they collected to Washington for inclusion in the FBI's file. This allowed them to amass the largest repository of fingerprints in the world. Despite making its reputation arresting the bank robbers and kidnappers of the 1930s, the FBI's main interest was anti-communism. That would have been okay, except that Hoover thought anyone whose politics were even slightly to the left of his was a communist. His and many Americans' fear of communism was exacerbated by the labor violence of the 1930s, which many people thought was being provoked by international communists. And as a result, the FBI found itself in the lead of domestic counterintelligence, and as an extension of that, formed an international espionage capability. Both of those would come in handy as the 1930s marched toward the Second World War. On May 26, 1940, the topic of President Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chat was national defense. In that broadcast, he talked about the European war and took aim at the isolationism that was still a strong presence in U.S. politics. In response to his chat, the president received a trove of telegrams, some of which were critical of the administration's foreign policy. Roosevelt selected 128 of those telegrams and had his press secretary send them to the FBI, suggesting the Bureau might want to take a look at them. Hoover ordered his agents to perform what was known as a name check in the Bureau's files. Any information, no matter how dubious, was placed in files that the agents created for those individuals. If no information was found, a file was still opened on that person to which information could be added in the future. The president also ordered the FBI to place wiretaps on the home telephones of people referred to as anti-interventionists, those opposed to the U.S. entering the European War. Chief among them was famed aviator Charles Lindbergh. Some of the president's closest advisors, including Harry Hopkins, were also included. FDR had come to believe that Hopkins' wife was passing anti-administration information to the right-leaning Washington Herald. At the time, Congress had made wiretaps expressly forbidden under Section 605 of the Communications Act of 1934. Even with a warrant, no person or agency could legally listen in on private telephone communications. Yet this did not seem to have been even a minor obstacle to either the FBI or President Roosevelt. It was during Roosevelt's term that the specter of national security was raised, justifying warrantless wiretapping. In conflict with Robert Jackson, his attorney general, who would later become an associate justice of the Supreme Court and chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, FDR believed that the Federal Communications Act was not applicable to national security issues, while the FBI believed it was not illegal for them to collect wiretap information for any purpose as long as they didn't divulge the gathered information to anyone. The real question is, who gets to decide what constitutes a national security issue and what does not? In practice, that person turned out to be J. Edgar Hoover. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away from a stroke and Harry Truman became president. During his first days in office, his military aide, General Harry Vaughn, brought a sheaf of FBI wiretap transcripts into the Oval Office for Truman to look at. Seeing what the general had brought, Truman snapped, "I don't have time for that foolishness." You have to applaud Harry's character, except that what he didn't do was tell the FBI to stop using illegal wiretaps. Hoover kept sending unsolicited personal memos to the president, which amounted to political gossip. Truman didn't seem interested, but again, he didn't tell Hoover to knock it off either. It was during the Eisenhower administration that the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, was begun. To be clear, the FBI was already engaging in most of the activities that later characterized COINTELPRO. They mainly focused on investigating and compiling files on people who were not suspected of any crimes. These were people who were outspoken about their political views, which were in opposition to the current government policies or just outside of societal norms of the time. In 1956, though, several new twists were added, including using government agencies and the legal system to harass people, placing agents provocateurs into various organizations, and distributing misinformation to discredit people. The targets were any person or group that threatened to upset the status quo. The program only expanded under the Kennedy administration, and it was Robert F. Kennedy who first ordered the FBI to wiretap Martin Luther King. Keep in mind that when this order was given in October of 1962, wiretaps for any purpose were still illegal. But that was the least of it. Dr. King got the full COINTELPRO treatment, with harassing phone calls to both himself and his wife, Coretta, federal agents following him about and not exactly trying to disguise their presence, and threatening letters, including one that encouraged him to commit suicide. The FBI also bugged King's home, his office, and any hotel room he stayed in. To go with the personal harassment of Dr. King, the FBI added a disinformation program targeting the civil rights movement in general, along with Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in particular. For this campaign, they brought out America's favorite monster under the bed, communism. Over a decade of investigation, the Bureau found that communist influence on the civil rights movement was minimal. One memo used the word infinitesimal to describe it. It didn't matter. The FBI wanted to neutralize Martin Luther King, and the avenue they chose was to discredit him through exposing his extramarital affairs and tying his movement to the Communist Party. Following a December 24, 1963 conference/planning session in Washington regarding the King operation, a chain of memos was written, culminating in the final memo to Assistant Director Alan Belmont. That memo ended with a paragraph stating, "We will continue to give this case priority attention both at the seat of government and in the field, and will expose King for the clerical fraud and Marxist he is at the first opportunity." Throughout the memo chain is the intent to hold any attacks against King until the opportune time in order to prevent any potential embarrassment to the Bureau. In 1967, Martin Luther King made a speech at the Riverside Church in New York in which he condemned the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. While domestic support for the war was slipping and the anti-war movement was gaining steam, the majority of Americans still supported the war. This made King's speech politically risky, but more than that, it incensed Lyndon Johnson, who now recognized the war as a potential threat to his presidency. Following the speech, the FBI ratcheted up its efforts against King to 11. The leading hook they had with which to attack Martin Luther King was his relationship with a man named Stanley Levison. To put it bluntly, Levison was a communist, or at least he had been. Where the vast majority of people who joined the Communist Party of the USA in the 30s resigned after a short time, Levison remained affiliated until severing his ties in the mid-50s. Shortly after that, he became acquainted with Martin Luther King and served as an advisor, treasurer, and occasional speechwriter. Now, it was common practice for Soviet intelligence agencies to tell prospective agents to cut all ties to any communist organizations, and that may have been the case with Levison, or it may not have been. Levison insisted to the end of his days that he was not a communist, but does it matter if he was? Even by the FBI's own assessment based on years of surveillance, communist influence on the civil rights movement was negligible. Nonetheless, J. Edgar Hoover was convinced that King and the civil rights movement were part of Moscow's grand design to subvert the United States. Since Hoover believed it, the people under him accepted it as fact and acted accordingly. In the end, it didn't matter. When Martin Luther King was assassinated by James Earl Ray in 1968, the Bureau moved on to other targets. In 1962, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were attending Merritt College in Oakland, California. While there, they joined the college's Afro-American Association, where they read, listened to lectures, and debated the issues facing Black people in America. They eventually developed a revolutionary and anti-imperialistic outlook as they met members of various Black nationalist groups and worked off campus at an anti-poverty center. Dissatisfied with the efforts of these organizations to protest the police brutality that was common in Oakland, Seale and Newton were inspired to form a group that would confront the police directly. This was the birth of the Black Panther Party. They made themselves known by operating free food distribution drives and offering meals to those in need. They also donned distinctive clothing consisting of black pants, black leather jackets, and black berets. In the 1960s, California allowed people to openly carry loaded firearms as long as they were kept in plain sight and not pointed at anyone. The Black Panthers took advantage of this and often went about armed. They started by establishing patrols in the black neighborhoods of Oakland, following the police and monitoring their interactions with the people. On May 2, 1967, the Panthers held a protest at the state capitol in Sacramento. Their protest was aimed at the Mulford Act, a law that made the open carry of loaded firearms illegal in California. The result was that Bobby Seale and 5 other members of the Panthers were arrested for disrupting a legislative session. The bill passed, and California's first major restriction on gun rights was signed into law by Governor Ronald Reagan. A 1967 memorandum outlined the FBI's goals regarding the civil rights movement and the various militant groups on its fringes, including the Black Panthers. Those goals were: prevent a coalition of militant black nationalist groups, prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant nationalist movement. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. Yeah, that's in the memo. Prevent violence on the part of black nationalist groups. We'll come back to that later. Prevent militant black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability by discrediting them. Prevent the long-range growth of militant black nationalist organizations, especially among youth. The groups that they were worried about engaging in violence included the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Nation of Islam, and the Revolutionary Action Movement. There were over 270 groups and individuals targeted by active COINTELPRO operations at the time, and that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was expressly nonviolent, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which actually had nonviolent in its name, were included as targets under the points listed as the purpose of COINTELPRO, is a good indicator of the FBI's feeling towards groups exercising their constitutional rights to effect changes in society. At the time this memo was written, the Black Panther Party was on the FBI's radar, but it was mainly considered a local problem for officials in California to handle. By 1969, the Panthers had chapters in most major cities, and J. Edgar Hoover personally corrected the oversight when he declared that the Black Panther Party was the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. In a memo to the FBI field offices, he said, "Schooled in the Marxist-Leninist ideology and the teaching of the Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong, its members have perpetrated numerous assaults on police officers and have engaged in violent confrontations with police throughout the country. Leaders and representatives of the Black Panther Party travel extensively all over the United States, preaching their gospel of hate and violence not only to ghetto residents, but to students in colleges, universities, and high schools as well." By 1969, the Black Panther Party was not just in the FBI's crosshairs. It became the primary target among civil rights and Black Power organizations. The Bureau began by targeting the Black Panthers' social activities, especially their Breakfast for Children program, which, in an extensive memo to the San Francisco field office, Hoover declared a major concern. The Panthers provided free breakfast to children in need regardless of their race. Hoover thought they were only doing this to curry favor with moderate Black and white community members, and this program posed a grave threat to national security. The director of what was effectively the National Police Force thought feeding hungry children before they went to school was a threat to national security. The San Francisco field office responded to the director's concern by sending anonymous letters to people served by the Panthers' free meal programs and spreading rumors directed at parents that their children were being indoctrinated with communist ideology. That did not have the desired effect, so the Bureau escalated its activities. One of the stated purposes of COINTELPRO was to prevent violence by what were termed militant groups. Yet the actions of the FBI promoted violence among them, a case in point. The Black Panthers were not the only militant group in California. There were numerous rivals, one of which was the organization US, sometimes called the U.S. organization, which the Panthers and the FBI referred to as the United Slaves. Both groups had different aims, but competed with each other for recruits, so there was already some built-in animosity between them. This eventually flared into gang warfare between the two, and the FBI fanned the flames. Following a shootout between the Panthers and the U.S. organization, Hoover sent a memo to the California field offices which noted that a state of gang warfare existed and added, in order to fully capitalize upon BPP and U.S. differences, as well as to exploit all avenues of creating further dissension in the ranks of the BPP, recipient offices are instructed to submit imaginative and hard-hitting counterintelligence measures aimed at crippling the BPP. There had been several incidents between the two groups in 1968 and early 1969 in which members of both were killed or wounded. In an attempt to stem the violence, the leadership of the Panthers and the U.S. organization had several meetings to try to resolve their differences. What followed was an announcement that the Panthers would not hold a grudge against the U.S. organization for the deaths of two BPP members in L.A. The FBI countered that move by creating and sending a series of cartoons to 5 Black Panther Party members and 2 underground newspapers in San Diego. The cartoons depicted the BPP as weak and ineffectual. 2 weeks later, after an announcement of another meeting between the groups to work out their differences, the FBI sent out more cartoons which convinced the Panthers that the U.S. organization was behind them and was ready to make a move against the BPP leadership. Within a month, the truce was broken and the violence escalated. A second front was opened to discredit the Panthers in the eyes of the public. The Bureau had several reporters in its pocket who could be relied upon to produce an unfavorable story when needed, and they ensured that any incident involving the Panthers was portrayed in the worst possible light. They could also develop their own media, the most egregious example being the Black Panther coloring book, showing line drawings of violence against white people and law enforcement. Individual drawings from the fabricated coloring book were reprinted with the ominous caption, "Designed for children, this book has been widely distributed." The book was widely distributed. The FBI sent copies of it to Safeway Stores Incorporated, Mayfair Markets, and Jack in the Box Corporation. These were donors to the Breakfast for Children program. The Bureau also sent anonymous letters to the Bishop of the San Diego Diocese claiming to be parishioners who were upset that a local priest was allowing the Panthers to use his church hall as a serving place for the free breakfast program. They backed this up with phone calls to the auxiliary bishop protesting the priest's support of the BPP program. This is a quote from the August 1969 memo requesting authorization to make the fraudulent calls. All of the above calls will be made from parishioners objecting to the use of their church to assist a Black militant cause. 2 of the callers will urge that Father Curran be removed as pastor of the church, One will threaten suspension of financial support of the church if the activities of the pastor are allowed to continue. A later memo to headquarters on the result of the operation stated that Father Curran had been removed and transferred to somewhere in New Mexico for permanent assignment. The free breakfast program at that church ended, and the memo concludes with the statement that Father Curran was completely neutralized. On December 4th, 1969, as the West Coast FBI field offices were maneuvering against the Black Panther Party, a new course was being plotted in the Midwest. The FBI had begun collaborating with local police to neutralize the BPP. Using information provided by the FBI, the Chicago police, directed by Cook County prosecutor Edward Hanrahan, staged a raid on an apartment occupied by Black Panther leader Fred Hampton. The FBI began monitoring Hampton in 1967, tapping his mother's phone in early 1968 and adding him to the Agitator Index as a key militant leader. Later that year, the FBI recruited William O'Neill, who was facing criminal charges, to infiltrate the Black Panther Party. The Bureau paid him a stipend and had charges against him for interstate car theft dropped. O'Neill did a good job for the FBI, quickly rising through the ranks of the BPP and becoming Hampton's bodyguard and head of security for the Chicago chapter. In January 1969, Fred Hampton had been negotiating with a Chicago street gang named the Blackstone Rangers to form a working alliance. The Chicago special agent in charge does not enlighten us as to the nature of the alliance, but he does lay out a plan for disrupting it. The Bureau would send a letter to Jeff Fort, leader of the Blackstone Rangers. The letter would claim to be coming from a person who knew several Black Panthers and say that the Panthers blamed Fort for obstructing their efforts in the neighborhoods. In response, the Panthers had put a hit out on him. It was signed, "A Black Brother You Don't Know." The purpose was to prevent any alliance between the two groups, and it was predicted that Fort would take preemptive action against Hampton and the Panthers. A later memo addressed the possibility of reversing the effort and fabricating a letter to Hampton with the intention of provoking retaliatory action by the Panthers against the Rangers. It was discarded based on the FBI's knowledge that the Panthers were not as prone to violence as the Rangers. In mid-November 1969, head of COINTELPRO operations in Chicago, Special Agent Roy Mitchell, met with William O'Neill and obtained a detailed floor plan of Hampton's apartment. The plan included the locations of the furniture and where Hampton regularly slept. Mitchell took the floor plan to Richard Jalovic, who oversaw a special police detail assigned to State's Attorney Edward Hanrahan. Mitchell and Jalovic met with Sergeant Daniel Groth, the unit's operational commander. Together, they planned a raid on the Hampton residence. At 4 a.m. December 4th, 1969, a 14-man police team kicked in the door of Hampton's apartment. There were 9 people inside, and it appears that the police came in guns blazing. There were 99 rounds fired, 98 by the officers and 1, which ended up in the ceiling, by Panther chapter head Mark Clark, who was killed along with Hampton in bursts of police gunfire. O'Neill was paid a $300 bonus for his information and assistance in the raid. In the aftermath, despite a major effort by the Chicago PD and the FBI to cover up what actually happened, the cover stories rapidly unraveled. The blatantly manipulated ballistics data, along with other fabricated evidence, resulted in State's Attorney Hanrahan, Richard Jalovic, and more than a dozen Chicago police officers being indicted for obstruction of justice. These indictments were only dropped as part of a quid pro quo agreement with the survivors of the raid, which resulted in all charges against them being dropped. The survivors then joined in a lawsuit against the Chicago police, the FBI, and other officials who had assisted in the cover-up. The case dragged on until 1982, when it was settled for $1.82 million. Similar operations in other cities produced similar results and caused the FBI to shift tactics to spurious prosecutions, through which those arrested were held in jail awaiting trial under high bail for months or even years. Now, Some Black Panther members did indeed commit crimes, including an attempted ambush of Oakland police officers that resulted in a 90-minute shootout that left 2 officers and one of the Panthers wounded. In the early 1970s, some members of the group became involved in drug dealing and eventually devolved into criminal gangs. As the 1970s wore on, the factionalism that eventually affects all radical movements took hold, and a younger generation, more prone to violence, began to gain control of the organization. The original leaders were either in jail or had fled to other countries, including North Vietnam, Cuba, and China. Pressures from the FBI and local law enforcement, along with the internecine warfare among the Panthers themselves and other Black Power movements, resulted in a lack of direction and falling membership. The Black Panthers dissolved in 1982. There were numerous targets of COINTELPRO, and time won't allow me to discuss them all, so I will conclude with this last one: the New Left. I'd like to begin by defining the New Left, but I can't nail down a definition. That's because neither could the FBI. The New Left seemed to consist of anyone who was even marginally famous and held beliefs that we would describe today as progressive, and who were either outspoken or provided monetary support to what the FBI considered leftist causes. The FBI referred to these people as parlor pinks. That term actually appears in the official FBI correspondence. For the uninitiated, the term comes from the 1920s when communists were referred to as Reds. People who were not necessarily communists but supported the cause were referred to as Pinkos, pink being a lighter shade of red. It was a favored insult used by Joseph McCarthy, Richard Nixon, and others. The FBI used the term parlor pink to describe a person who was famous, wealthy, or intellectual. They imagined this type of person attending parties, standing around, a martini in hand, pinky raised, of course, discussing communist ideology. To the FBI, Jean Seberg fell into that category. She was a pretty young girl from Iowa who managed to land the title role in Otto Preminger's St. Joan. Her selection as a total newcomer after a nationwide search got great press, but the critics panned both her and the film. A second attempt in Bonjour Tristesse, also directed by Preminger, did not do much better at the box office. In 1959, she starred in The Mouse That Roared, and her career began on a steady upward arc through the 1960s as she appeared in Paint Your Wagon, Airport, and also moved between American and European cinema. Starting in the late 1960s, Jean began to donate to civil rights causes, including the Muskogee Nation, a Native American settlement near her hometown in Iowa, to whom she gave $500 for basketball uniforms, and donations totaling about $10,500 to the Black Panthers, ostensibly to support their Breakfast for Children program. This put her in the FBI's sights. Seberg's case was unusual in that the operation was directly overseen by J. Edgar Hoover, with regular reports sent to Attorney General John Mitchell and to White House Domestic Affairs Chief John Ehrlichman of Watergate fame, who kept President Richard Nixon informed on its progress. While still married to French novelist and diplomat Romain Gary, Seberg began a brief affair with a Mexican student activist named Carlos Navarra. She became pregnant, and the FBI leaped into action. It was 1970, and a simple affair, even one that resulted in a pregnancy, wasn't salacious enough for the Bureau's purposes, so they added a twist. The FBI planted a story with LA Times gossip columnist Joyce Haber that Seberg, thinly disguised as Miss A in the article, was pregnant by a prominent member of the Black Panthers. Newsweek magazine didn't bother hiding any identities when it picked up the story. It named Jean Seberg and announced that the father was Black Panther Minister of Education Raymond Hewitt. Hewitt was a good choice for the operation because he had also been a Marxist activist before joining the Panthers. Basically, he was a black man, a black nationalist, and a communist. That was the FBI trifecta for Boogeyman, and an alleged affair with him almost guaranteed maximum damage to a white actress's reputation with the mid-America movie-going public. Upon seeing the article, Seberg became so distraught that she went into labor and delivered a baby girl 4.5 months prematurely. The baby passed after 2 days. Seberg and her husband sued Newsweek, asking $200,000 in damages. The court found in their favor and ordered Newsweek to print a retraction in their magazine and 8 daily newspapers. The couple was awarded $10,800 in damages. Undeterred, the FBI initiated an aggressive program of what amounted to harassment against Seberg. When she was in the U.S., her residences were burglarized and she was subjected to aggressive surveillance in which the FBI made almost no effort to disguise their presence. Her phones were tapped for years. She mainly lived in Europe, where the FBI could not operate, but that was no problem. Both the CIA and Army intelligence were happy to assist. The article and the harassment also impacted her career, as producers did not want to deal with her situation, so Hollywood stopped calling. All of this weighed heavily on her and took a toll on her mental and emotional health. She began drinking heavily and taking medications for anxiety and depression. She attempted to take her own life several times, more than once on the anniversaries of her daughter's passing. On August 30th, 1979, Jean disappeared from her Paris apartment. Her new husband, Ahmed Hosni, claimed that the couple had gone to see a movie and returned home late. When he awoke the next morning, she was gone. Her body was found 9 days later in her car, which was parked not far from where she lived. She was in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket. There was a bottle of barbiturates and an empty mineral water bottle on the floor. The coroner determined that she was so intoxicated before she passed that she could not have gotten in the car by herself, but there were no alcohol bottles in the car. This led to the conclusion that someone had put her in the car and left her without seeking help. The French police filed charges against persons unknown for failing to assist a person in danger. Jean Seberg is buried in the Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris. She was 40 years old. Her second husband, Romain Gary, stated that the harassment she suffered at the hands of the FBI took a heavy toll on her, resulting in her mental and emotional instability in the years that followed. To paraphrase a line from a movie, the FBI neutralized Jean Seberg with extreme prejudice. And that's our story. This was hard to write. It's a rabbit hole, and here I have barely touched the surface. The deeper I got into the subject, the angrier I became. We Americans like to call this the land of the free, but how free are we when one megalomaniac government employee and a coven of sycophants can get together and destroy people's lives for no better reason than political disagreements? The Black Panthers were not angels, and I'm not trying to paint them that way. The organization had criminal elements, especially in its later years as it became factionalized. But there were and are legal means of addressing criminality. So when the Black Panthers formed in California, what were they trying to do? The police in Oakland were routinely brutalizing black people, and the Panthers wanted to stop it. Their methods were unsettling, even terrifying to some, but at the time they started using those methods, they were perfectly legal. Make no mistake, the only reason the Mulford Act banning open carry of loaded firearms became law was because black people were carrying the firearms. As soon as the Panthers showed up on the streets armed, Mr. NRA himself, Ronald Reagan, was all for gun control, as was the NRA itself. Because some members of the Panthers openly espoused Marxist doctrines, they turned into the establishment's worst possible nightmare: armed, communist black men. The only reason a program like COINTELPRO was allowed to exist, the only reason a man like J. Edgar Hoover was allowed to remain in a position of power for so long, was particularly endemic in America: an irrational fear of communism. Communism was, and still is, the great boogeyman of American politics. But here's the thing: Marxism is a failed ideology. Communism is a failed economic system. Even among countries that have so-called communist governments today, China, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam, only Laos could qualify as a communist country, and even they have adopted limited market economy reforms. North Korea is a personality cult, and the others are dictatorships that have come over to the capitalist camp. The possibility that communism would fail so badly was not readily apparent to the average American in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but there were those in government who fully understood the nature of the communist regimes, their strengths and weaknesses. They were not listened to. Adding to that chaos in the world was the growing chaos at home, campus unrest, mass protests, and the rise of more and more militant civil rights groups. This justified the actions of the FBI in their minds. The blanket of national security covered everything they were doing. But we have to ask, was feeding children breakfast before they went to school a threat to national security? Was buying uniforms for a Native American basketball team a threat? As a people, we cannot allow any government agency to take away our freedoms under the guise of protecting those freedoms. We cannot allow the authorities to subvert the law in the name of enforcing the law. Today, in the post-9/11 world, it is almost a requirement to venerate law enforcement. You cannot criticize them because they are our first responders dedicated to protecting us. They're all heroes. However, the truth is that there are times when they must be criticized, and it is our duty as citizens not only to support them, but also to hold them accountable. Failure to do that will eventually place us in a situation where we don't need to be protected by them as much as we need to be protected from them. For our country to survive, we as citizens must protect the rule of law and hold everyone in government accountable for upholding it. If the law does not protect everyone, then it does not protect anyone. If the government can snatch that person you don't like for whatever reason off the street today, what is to stop them from snatching you off the street tomorrow? This has been Crime Noir, Episode 7, COINTELPRO. If you find this story interesting and want to see more like it, help us out by hitting those like and subscribe buttons. If you know of a crime you'd like us to visit, mention it in the comments. Stay tuned for our next episode. I'm not quite sure what that will be just yet, but stay tuned.